Good morning, everyone. Welcome to DBT Coalesce. Thank you to our hosts for having us. Today we're going to be talking about marrying extract and load and data activation, and why, as a single in a single combined platform, that's such a powerful proposition. Before we get too far into that, though, I do want to introduce myself briefly. My name is Charles Giardina. I'm the VP of Engineering at Airbyte. I'm also one of the founding engineers there. I've been working in data for over 10 years now, and in every role that I've had as a software engineer, I have had to rebuild ingestion and distribution of data in some form, whether that was for ads, for OpenStreetMap data, traffic data. And so something that's like deeply personal to me at this point is getting to a place where we can build tools and abstractions such that software engineers can focus on work that differentiates their product, and they don't need to rebuild ingestion and distribution of data over and over and over again. And so that's very much the thing that motivates me, motivates Airbyte. And what we're going to be talking about today is really focused on data activation. So if you've heard of Airbyte before, you've probably heard about us as a data movement or an extract and load platform. And so that's usually pulling data out of an API or a database into your data warehouse. Today we're actually going to be focusing on the other side of that. That's taking data out of your data warehouse and moving it back into your operational tools. And we'll really get into what that means. So our roadmap today, we're going to actually use a real customer of Airbyte to sort of guide our conversation a little bit, understand a real customer problem, why we felt data activation was a really good option for them. We'll walk through our specific solution a little bit, and then at the end, understand why that was so impactful for this customer and how it fits into the currents of our industry. All right, the problem. So we're going to be talking about a pharmaceutical company. We're not allowed to use their name, and it's far too complicated for me to keep a bunch of anonymous pronouns in my head, so I'm going to call them Valora. That is not the real company's name, but that's what we use for this talk. But this is a pharmaceutical company. They build things, they make antibiotics, vaccines, they work on HIV medication, and things like that. So a lot of really important work that they're doing there. And the key thing to understand about a business like this is that it's really complicated. Not only do they have all of like the go-to-market and customer success motions like any business might have, but they're managing trials, they're understanding patient data across multiple hospitals and multiple data systems. And so this is a really complex business, especially when it comes to data. And so with this company, we were specifically working with their commercial analytics team. And the main thing that they were trying to do was support their customer success team to better support their customers. And so you can imagine if you have this very complex business, to be a really good customer success manager, you have to know what's actually happening with your customer. And if you don't, then it's pretty hard to make them successful. And they were falling down there, and we'll get into some details on why. And so if we look at their initial data infrastructure, when we started talking to them about data activation, they actually were already working with Airbyte because, as I alluded to before, they had all of these really niche and custom APIs that they were working with. And so the open source connector builder that we have allowed them to integrate with all of these APIs that other data movement tools couldn't support for them. But then the problem they had after that is, even though they had a really advanced data warehouse set up, their data team was doing like really incredible work, they were then struggling to get that data back into Salesforce. And if you think about a customer success team, they don't want to be in other dashboards, they don't want to be in other tools, they want to go live in Salesforce. But they were struggling to get that data into Salesforce because they didn't really have a proper tool of pulling data out of their data warehouse and back into Salesforce. They were using a tool called Nitro, and Nitro is it's a CRM that is built on top of Salesforce. It is not fundamentally a tool that's really designed for data movement, but the reason they were using it is that it is a CRM that is tailor-made for life sciences products. But essentially what the piece that wasn't fitting there is because Nitro wasn't designed to bring all of this diverse data back into Salesforce. Essentially, like, they couldn't get all of their data into Salesforce, and what data that they could get in, they had to do it via this patchwork of Python scripts. And so basically in our conversation with them, the thing that we were able to pick apart is that orchestration is a huge problem for them. They had data coming in on one side, going out on the other side, and were really having trouble tying it together. They were using this specialized tool that wasn't really made for moving data. And then finally, because they were using all of these Python scripts, anytime they made any change in their data warehouse, everything downstream would break in really esoteric ways. And they would essentially have to play a game of whack-a-mole where the customer success team would tell them, hey, we're missing data, and then they would need to go find some expert on that script that got written 3 years ago and have someone go figure out what was going on. And so that was really an untenable solution if you're really trying to empower this customer success team. And so as the conversation developed with them, we started talking about data activation. And what is data activation? I think the easiest way to think about this is that it is a broader term for what most people think of as reverse ETL. And when I say broader, this is because it usually is including some streaming use cases, AI use cases as well. And fundamentally at Airbyte, we want to make sure that we're hitting all of those use cases. Now, that being said, if you already know what reverse ETL is, you can really think of them as synonymous for the context of this talk. And if you don't know what reverse ETL is, basically it is the process of taking data out of your data warehouse and moving it back into any operational tool. So in this case, we're talking about Salesforce. But to just pull another example for clarity, you can imagine that if you're putting together email campaigns in MailChimp, that you might want to enrich your data in MailChimp to filter on only the most valuable users that you want to hit with that email campaign. And you do that by pulling your data out of your warehouse and moving it into MailChimp. And so what we really came back to as we started thinking about data activation and how this was all going to fit together is that it's really powerful to have this all in one place as a single pane of glass. Because fundamentally, all of the data that you have in your Salesforce or your operational tools is a derivative of the data that you have in your data warehouse. And all of the data that you have in your data warehouse is a derivative of all of the data that you're pulling from all of your other data silos, whether it's your database, custom APIs, etc. And so if you can't see in one place how that all fits together, it becomes really difficult to understand what is happening with your data. The other piece that was very much already in our DNA is that it was really important to build a lot of this on an extensible open source platform. So we had already experienced a lot of this coming from the connector builder in our extract and load product, of being able to give tools to the community to build their own integrations, allowed for a huge proliferation of integrations getting built. The other piece that can be a little unintuitive about this, but is how much data activation actually increases the power of your data warehouse. So the problem that this company was having before they introduced data activation is that they were doing all of this amazing work in their data warehouse, but then it wasn't getting used anywhere. It wasn't able to get into the operational systems. And by having a process by which they could guarantee anytime they made a change in their data warehouse, that was going to get propagated into their operational systems, meant that they were actually getting the value of all of the great analysis that their data team was doing. And so for us, it really came back to the message of getting out of this world where you have a separate reverse ETL product and really having all data movement captured in one spot is a really, really powerful abstraction. Now, Airbyte obviously comes from a pedigree of extract and load. And so naturally, we approached adding a data activation product as, well, is that just kind of the same thing we already did, but the opposite? And the natural reason to do that is because if it is, then there's a lot we could reuse there. The good news for us is it turns out there was a ton of overlap. All of this stuff around extensibility and building out huge connector libraries, we already knew how to do a lot of that. And then anytime you have a data pipeline, it is only as valuable as your ability to observe it. So what we have learned over the years is that if you can't see when there's an anomaly in your pipeline or something is failing and it needs some sort of intervention, that leaves you in a place where you can't actually trust your data stack. And so all of the observability things that we had learned for extract and load felt like they cross-applied really nicely to data activation. The place where things started to differ is around filtering and what I would call small t transformations. And we'll get into that a little bit in a second. But fundamentally, we did sort of come out of this exercise saying, yeah, there's a ton of overlap between what we already have built and what data activation should look like, and bringing that all into one spot seems like it's going to be really valuable. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of what our solution ended up looking like. This is the original architecture diagram that we had for Valora. And after that, we simplified it so that they were able to remove a data orchestration tool that they had. They were able to stop using the CRM tool for data activation, and it left them with a much simpler architecture. As we started thinking about what does data activation look like, especially when you're starting to build that on top of an extract and load platform, we wanted to make sure that we took with us all of the lessons that we had from extract and load. And so that's making sure we were building in all of the flexibility that was so important in extract and load and bringing that into data activation. Turns out there are a lot of APIs out in the world, and a lot of them work very differently. And so in order to cover all of the use cases from moving data back into your operational system, you need a lot of flexibility about how data moves in there. So are you replacing all of the data every time you're syncing data? Are you just replacing data that's been updated recently? Or do you want to avoid replacing data at all and really just append data to your system? Really, once you get into these operational systems, all of these little knobs end up mattering a lot, and we wanted to make sure that they were in place from the get-go. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to talk a little bit about transformations, and this is where things started to differ a little bit from extract and load. And this is because our paradigm when we think about extract and load is always to to only transform data as little as possible before it hits the warehouse. The reason for that is because transformations tend to be the most volatile part of your data stack. And that makes sense because as your business evolves, the transformations, the aggregations that you want to do are going to evolve with it. And so what's really important is that you're able to make those transformations without accidentally incurring a ton of extra cost. And the cost that I'm referring to here is that pulling data from remote data silos ends up being very expensive, both in terms of time and compute cost. Like if you're pulling data, a lot of data from an API that is very slow, every time you change a column name in your transformation stack, you don't want to have to go re-pull all of that data. And so that's something that's like super core to the way that we think about extract and load. A little different in data activation though, right? Because in data activation, the APIs the data is going into ends up having a very strict schema. If you are trying to load a contact into Salesforce, it has to have exactly the schema that Salesforce expects, otherwise that record is not going anywhere. And so the reality is most data teams, they do a lot of great work, they aggregate all of this data, but it doesn't come out of DBT necessarily looking exactly like what Salesforce is expecting. And that makes sense because fundamentally that is kind of an integration concern anyway. And especially if that data is then going to move into other operational systems, it makes sense that you want to do that transformation at the moment that you're starting to move that data and not put that on your data team. And so the key thing that I really want to call out here is while in extract and load, we're like very draconian about like, don't transform anything until it ends up in your warehouse. For data activation, we're very much in the world of do whatever you need to do in your warehouse, and then we can do whatever tweaks are necessary to make sure that it's going to fit into your operational system. And so the solution that we've built around that is the ability to detect exactly what the schema is that any API is expecting, and then help you map your data to that API and make whatever those tweaks might be. The other transformation bit that ends up being a lot more important in data activation than in extract and load is around filtering. And I think the easy example is to think around a lot of data stewardship examples. If you're moving data into an API that might exist in the US, and you happen to also have some EU data in your data warehouse, you want to be in a position where you're not accidentally breaking GDPR compliance rules by putting data in the right spot. And so all of this filtering ends up actually being much, much more important in the data activation world. The last problem that I think is really interesting to look at from the extract and load lens and the data activation lens is what to do when a record is we are not able to move a record. And in the data movement space, everybody always sort of naively wants to assume like every record is going to move every time and it's just going to be perfect. But the reality is data is a mess all the time. And Imagine you have a booth at this conference right now and you're collecting leads. You want to be in a position that if you collect 2,000 leads, if one of those leads put in a weird character in their address and that data can't get into Salesforce, you don't want to block the other 2,000 leads from getting into Salesforce. And so, this is a nuanced thing, that understanding that there are always going to be some records that leave you in a place where you may want to skip them. The way we've always thought about that in extract and load is to essentially materialize metadata in your data warehouse to tell you if we had to make a change. The canonical example is for Redshift. They have really strict limitations on the size of data that you can put in any individual field in a record, right? And so if you go over that limit, what we end up doing is nulling out that record, and we drop some metadata saying, hey, we nulled out that field because of a Redshift limitation. And then based on that metadata, you can decide if you want to go change the way your data looks, but at least that has been surfaced to you. Now you can imagine that as you're loading data into APIs, most APIs don't work that way. Like if you give it a record and it's like, I can't do anything with that record, they're not gonna like kindly hang on to some metadata for you to help you figure out what to do next. And so that required a slightly different solution. And the way we've thought about that in the context of data activation is to let you provide a blob store where we will then write any record that we could not put into an API and then add metadata there explaining why it couldn't be written. And then ultimately it's on you to decide, do we want to make some modification to that record so that it can be loaded, or perhaps that record was an anomaly anyway and we're happy to just drop it. So let's come back to our customer. I really want to come back to the business impact that they saw. And so in talking with their team after they've adopted this data activation product, the main thing that they were really excited about was the reduction of total cost of ownership, getting to a place where they were able to get rid of this orchestration tool, get rid of this CRM tool, or at least stop misusing it, was a really powerful thing for them because it reduced, one, the number of things they were spending money on, but also the number of tools that their engineers needed to understand how to use. The other super important thing about consolidating all of these workflows is that it allowed them to get rid of all of this Python scripting that was ending up being a huge reliability concern for them. And on top of that, because it's now all in a platform that is built for data movement, it has all of the handling to help for cases where a record can't properly be moved or a change happens upstream with a schema, and then you need to make sure that all of those changes are then propagated downstream. Having that all in a platform that is purpose-built for that is incredibly important. The other thing that they were really excited about is there were all of these out-of-the-box tools in Salesforce that they wanted to use that leverage AI and modeling to help customer success teams get ahead of problems. But previously, because they weren't able to get all of their data into Salesforce, they weren't able to use any of these really cool tools. And so now, with what they were doing with our data activation product, they were in a place where all that data was now in Salesforce, and they could go leverage a lot of those cool tools. And finally, and this may feel super obvious, but I just want to come back to it. For the customer here, fundamentally, was the customer success managers. And the thing they cared about was being in Salesforce. They did not want to be in a bunch of different tools. And so having a tool, a data movement platform that allowed getting everything into Salesforce was a huge boon for their efficiency. So that was very focused on what things ended up looking like for this customer and how this was valuable to them. I want to take a moment to sort of take a step back and tie it into what I think are the currents of the current data industry. I actually had the honor of speaking at this conference 3 years ago back in New Orleans. And I think that was still kind of the zenith of the modern data stack. Data teams were really excited to use a lot of different tools. Everybody wanted to use the best in breed in every vertical, whether it was data movement or lineage or data quality and things like that. The reality is that those currents have changed pretty significantly. Some of that is from budgets changing, but the reality is our industry is maturing as well, and that's a great thing. And so the view that I'm starting to see here is that the power of having your entire data stack consolidated into a single platform, the value there is starting to dominate having best in breed in necessarily every single little vertical. And that total cost of ownership is just becoming more and more a problem that is really top of mind for data teams. And so we keep coming back to the single pane of glass where you can fully understand the life cycle of all of your data. The thing that hasn't changed, though, is the importance of open source. And so obviously, DBT Core has been the poster child for open source for so long. Airbyte has started as open source, and that has been in our DNA since the beginning. The reason we have been able to build so many integrations in such a short period of time is because we have provided open source tools to the community to help people unblock themselves, to build integrations themselves, and then share those integrations with everyone around them. And so we keep coming back to the importance of open source and extensibility, and that also allows you to avoid a lot of vendor lock-in problems and allows you to move your data in exact wherever you need it to go. So based on sort of like my analysis of where the industry is going, you should probably be able to guess what's next on my engineering roadmap, which is basically moving a little bit more into the data orchestration space so that data teams can really be in a position where they're able to use a single platform to do everything related to moving and managing and observing their data. And so to wrap it up here, fundamentally, the position we take at Airbyte is that coming back to this vision of the open data stack and leaning into open source and into a single pane of glass there is a really exciting future for data teams. Thank you. I think we have about 5 minutes. If there are questions, I'm happy to take them. Go for it. Yeah, so the question was, what are the trusted destinations for the data activation product right now? So right now, obviously, we have Salesforce, we have Customer IO, and HubSpot. And again, because we've built this connector development kit underneath it, we essentially plan to build out pretty quickly a bunch more integrations. Yeah, great question. Is this mainly for batch processing, or are there is there a real-time component? Currently, we are really focused on micro batches, and so underneath Airbyte, that has always been the tool that we've used. Is we've found that most data teams are in a position where micro batching essentially gives the right trade-off between latency and efficient throughput, because essentially streaming ends up getting really expensive as data gets bigger. So right now we remain focused on the micro batching. Yeah, I don't have it in this slide deck, but there's, obviously the vision that I'm describing here is right. I really want Airbyte to be this single pane of glass for data movement, whether it's micro batches or streaming, et cetera. And so our plan is to move into those spaces as well. Yes. Yeah, so great question. I'm going to sort of summarize it as it's really great to have a UI for mapping from your data warehouse to an API, but how do you know when an upstream change is going to break that? And just one, how do you make it, or second, how do you make it more manageable as well? Both really good questions. One of the things AI is actually great at is a lot of pattern matching, right? And so like for a lot of these tools, like the vision there is to like use LLMs to help make the process of doing those mappings really, really easy. So that's I think more the second part. The first part around understanding how upstream changes are affecting things. Essentially right now we have that rejected records feature that I was showing you, but essentially what we're also building out is more anomaly detection within the platform so that as things change, you're able to know about that proactively and go ahead and change it. The other benefit of having everything in a single platform is that you can start to build that lineage across the extract and load and the transformation really, really easily. Some of that does not exist in the platform right now, but it's a very obvious place that we want to bring it. Yeah. Yes. Our position is every new product we build starts out open source. And so the connector development kit for destinations is pretty raw yet. And so we haven't publicized it a lot because we want to sort of give it a few more reps before we like really push it to the community. But yes, it is all public. All of our products are open source.